Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Cambridge, Massachusetts by Alex Whiting. He's a former ICC investigation and prosecution coordinator. In Washington, D.C., we have former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Stephen Rademaker, who served in the George W. Bush administration. And in Addis Ababa, Awol Allo. He's a lecturer at Keele Law School. I thank you all for joining us. Let me start with you, Alex Whiting. It was some speech by John Bolton at the U.S. Federalist Society, gunning for the ICC. Brutal. Was it justified?
No. Well, we've seen this speech before. We've seen this movie before, and it failed the first time that John Bolton led this kind of policy back in 2002. Ultimately, the President Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice rejected the strategy because they saw that it was contrary to U.S. interests, that a policy of complete hostility to the ICC is swimming against the tide. And so they moved to a more nuanced policy, which every administration since has maintained. So Bolton is trying to return to this failed strategy. It's both unjustified and unwise.
Stephen Rademaker, the ICC is already dead to us. Some would say, methinks the lady doth protest too much, I think, as they say. Does the US have something to hide? Why is it okay for the ICC to investigate everybody else, but not the United States, if there's reasonable suspicion or probable cause?
I don't think Secretary Bolton said it was okay for the ICC to investigate everybody else. The United States has nothing to hide. The ICC is a completely failed institution. As Secretary Bolton pointed out, it's spent about $1.5 billion over the course of its existence, has 8 convictions to show for it, of which he didn't point this out. 4 of those, who are supposed to be among the worst war criminals on the planet, were sentenced to terms in prison of 11 months or less. So the ICC has very little to show for itself. I think it's going to try and make up for all the deficiencies of its past by turning against Americans. And the differences between today as compared to the Bush administration, during the Bush administration, the ICC prosecutor was not actually making efforts to bring American soldiers and American personnel before the court. But today, that is exactly what the prosecutor is doing, which I think accounts for some of the comments that Bolton made.
So to be clear, you believe that the United States is being deliberately singled out?
Well, the ICC has a record of almost unbroken failure, and I think it needs, as an institution, it needs to demonstrate success somewhere. And I think the effort to commence an investigation in Afghanistan may represent that.
Right. Okay. But say, for example, 2012, Thomas Lubanga, sentenced to 14 years in prison, DRC. He sort of brought children into his militia, right? Sentenced for conscripting children as child soldiers. You would accept, even though they don't have a fantastic record, someone like Lubanga deserves to be behind bars, right, Stephen?
If you're asking me whether he deserves to be behind bars, absolutely. There are plenty of war criminals out there. The question is the ICC the most effective institution for bringing them to justice? And I think after expending $1.5 billion, and as I said, only bringing 8 individuals to justice, 4 of whom were sentenced to 11 months in prison or less, that's not much of a record of success.
Well, Allo, as we look at the big picture here, it's in a way somewhat ironic that the Trump administration and many African countries both don't like the ICC, perhaps for slightly different reasons. What does this tell us about international justice right now?
Absolutely. African countries have been expressing concerns around the ways in which the ICC has been investigating cases. But the concern that's expressed by African countries is not slightly, actually radically different from the concern that the United States has been expressing. In Africa, the problem is that while there are war crimes and other crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of the ICC committed elsewhere, outside the African continent, almost 10 out of the 11 cases the court has considered in the past is from Africa. So there is this concern that the ICC is singling out African countries and excessively focusing on Africa, and therefore there's a perception on the part of leaders that this is an institution that's being used as a tool by Western countries to go after African leaders. But in terms of the United States, I think the United States has not been a party. The United States have done everything it can, frankly, to undermine the ICC. Now, to claim that the ICC has not been effective, when in fact it's the United States that in so many ways undermined the ICC. In some cases, actually used the ICC. In the case of Sudan, for example, using its membership of the Security Council. That is slightly ironic to me, just
right.
as, for example, the claims of African countries is somewhat a bit exaggerated.
Okay, so Alex Whiting, whether the kind of support or the parallel with the African countries right now from Bolton and the Trump administration by saying, well, the ICC doesn't work, it only singles out African countries and it doesn't have a great track record, whether that is disingenuous or not, at the moment the US and many African countries are on the same page. Don't they have a point, at least from the perspective that the ICC hasn't worked very well? The US did not ratify the Rome Statute in 2002. And if there is a case to be heard vis-a-vis Afghanistan, why doesn't the Afghan government just bring it up directly with the United States? Why do you have to bring in a faulty institution like the ICC to have a look?
Well, I think it's vastly overstating the case to say that the ICC is a failed institution. It's a very new institution. It's been at it for only 16 years to develop this kind of a project, a new court that has international scope. That's the blink of an eye. And in fact, in that time, it has had 8 convictions. There are 4 defendants who are currently on trial. There's another one waiting trial. There's 14 arrest warrants that are pending. The court is investigating in 9 different countries. And the measure of the success of the court is not these numbers ultimately. It's what it does to shape the conversation and the conduct of states. And I think there's plenty of evidence that that states and individual leaders are paying a lot of attention to the court, namely John Bolton, and are thinking about what the court stands for, and the court is shaping the conversation and both and also the practices of countries with respect to the conduct in war. Right. With respect to the jurisdiction in Afghanistan and the fact that the United States is not a state party, that's true. It's not a state party, and it has no legal obligation to cooperate with the court. However, Afghanistan is a state party, and the crimes that are alleged occurred on the territory of Afghanistan. And there's no legal problem. Afghanistan has joined the court, has ceded some of its jurisdiction to the court. And so if the cases are not prosecuted in Afghanistan, which they haven't been, the court has legal authority to proceed on those cases. The court has not been eager, as Stephen suggests, to go after the United States. It has really dragged its feet because it's not likely to succeed on these cases. It has not targeted the United States, not rushed to do these cases. These are cases from 2002 to 2003.
Right, Stephen. So let me bring in Stephen. Stephen, this is it's an almost hypothetical question because it's all based on the ICC's prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, suggesting that this could happen, right? And as Awol Allo said, if anything, it's the African countries that have a case to be made that the court has been eager to go after them. Where's the evidence that the ICC is trying to sort of balance the books here by going after the United States?
Well, the prosecutors asked for authority to go after the United States. So, I mean, that's the source of the concern. And I do think it's correct to say that the pressure being brought to by African governments, which is well-founded. I mean, they have a case to make that this is basically a Europe-based institution that's trying to bring European justice to bear in Africa. I mean, that all of the cases that have been before the court so far have involved Africans, which has led to questions in Africa about what kind of post-colonial or neo-colonial imposition this court is, and that is a problem for the court. Will the court seek to compensate for that by finding high-profile Western defendants, for example, Americans protecting U.S. national interests in Afghanistan, to try and make them examples and try and answer the concern that the court is only bringing alleged war criminals to justice in Africa?
Certainly.
I think that was part of Bolton's concern.
Right, but reading the transcript of his speech very closely, what was interesting is that he wasn't quite talking about the fact that there's this overwhelming appetite from the ICC to go after the United States. Built into it, more so, was the fact that Bolton was absolutely convinced that we don't commit crimes. We don't do this. Since 9/11, we're fighting a just cause, and they want to come after us and our allies. It's a little bit convenient to believe that you've done nothing wrong, and that seems to be where John Bolton's coming from, right?
I don't think that's where Bolton's coming from at all. And I don't think any American would assert that during the course of armed conflicts, American soldiers never commit crimes. What American officials would contend is that we have our own legal system. We have systems of accountability. We bring American officers, American soldiers who commit war crimes to justice within the American system. The ICC was supposed to take that into account. There was this principle embedded in the Rome Statute called complementarity, and supporters of the court always assured America that it never had anything to worry about because the principle of complementarity embedded in the Rome Statute ensured that no American would ever be prosecuted because America would bring its war criminals to justice. But we're seeing in Afghanistan that this so-called principle of complementarity has no meaning whatsoever in the eyes of the prosecutor.
Alex Whiting, does the U.S. system have enough strength? Is it robust enough in order for the United States to investigate its own potential or possible atrocities that might have taken place?
The United States has a terrific track record of prosecuting its own soldiers, and ordinarily and in principle, the United States should have nothing to worry about. The problem here is, and it's the looming problem, is torture. That in 2002, 2003, the government sanctioned interrogation techniques that indisputably amounted to torture, and I doubt that Stephen would dispute that. Those cases, there have been investigations. There's been correction of those practices, both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, but there have not been prosecutions, and that's the problem.
Stephen, we saw the revelations of the McCain-Feinstein investigation, the Senate investigation, what many people call the torture report. Doesn't Alex make a point that this would help bring about smoother justice for torture that might have taken place?
Well, if he's arguing that America needs the help of the International Criminal Court to bring American soldiers, American officials to justice, he's certainly entitled to make that argument, but I think it is precisely that argument that concerns Secretary Bolton, and I believe most Americans. I think most Americans would disagree with the proposition that our system of justice in this country is so broken that we need the assistance of the International Criminal Court to come in and hold Americans accountable for violations of international legal norms. I don't know if Professor Whiting is suggesting that he thinks that we need that kind of help, but I'm astonished if that's his position.
Alex,
I'm not making that argument. I'm not making the argument that we need that help, that we can't do it on our own. What I'm saying is that we are in this predicament with the International Criminal Court because of the problem of torture. Now, the Obama administration did not join the court. There's no administration that is at present going to join the court. And I'm not suggesting that that would be wise at this stage. However, that's a very different thing than an all-out assault on the principle of international criminal justice and on the International Criminal Court. We can choose to not be in the court, but still cooperate with it and still have a constructive relationship and not abandon international criminal justice altogether.
Okay, and talking about international criminal justice in the big picture, Awol Allo, we saw South Africa threatening to leave the ICC because they felt that the ICC was twisting their arm in trying to force them to arrest Omar al-Bashir because the ICC had, charged and wanted Omar al-Bashir to face justice in The Hague. South Africa did not do that. They didn't arrest the Sudanese president. So we have that with the South Africans. We have this with the Trump administration now. Are we seeing less appetite around the world for people, for countries to want to play ball with the ICC? Are we seeing less respect for the institution?
What we know for sure is that the United States and the Europeans are equally complicit in the crimes that are set out in the Rome Statute. And in most cases, most European countries are not really willing to prosecute individuals when they commit these crimes outside the United States, in most cases in the battlefield, or for Europeans as well. This is true, for example, with respect to British soldiers in in Iraq, the case of torture that the two guests have been talking about. But I think one of the concerns in Africa here is precisely the kinds of exceptionalism that we see in the West that claims that the ICC should not have any jurisdiction over our soldiers and servicemen, but it is absolutely fine for us to refer those countries that are not parties to the ICC through the Security Council. Therefore, the ICC would have access, would have jurisdiction over these countries. And a lot of African countries find this problematic. And I think the case of the South Africa, the Rwandan situation, not Rwanda, the Burundi situation, are different. So there are some African countries who are authoritarian and repressive at home, and use this neo-colonial argument to somewhat shield their own repressive practices. But the South African case is slightly different.
Okay. Well, Awol, Stephen, and Alex, unfortunately, I've got to move on. But I'd like to thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Alex Whiting, Stephen Rademaker, and Awol Allo.